Thank you very much. A pleasure to be here to talk to the Lymm Festival, your winter warmer. Yep, the first of two short talks. This one is Star of Bethlehem. I'm sure we have all heard of it, but the question is, could it actually have existed? Do we know about the facts rather than the narrative? So what I'm going to do this evening is recount or recap the Gospel of St. Matthew, because like everybody else, I wasn't totally familiar with what was actually written in the Gospel of St. Matthew. So we'll just remind ourselves about that. And then I'll talk about the possible astronomical candidates that we think were in the sky 2,000 years ago that might conceivably have been the origin of the Star of Bethlehem. And then we'll think about whether the dates match up. In other words, there were things in the sky 2,000 years ago. Were they around at about the right time to be a Star of Bethlehem? And then I'll use some planetarium software, the sort of software you can get for your phone or your iPad or your laptop that shows you the night sky. And there's no reason why you can't simply ask for not the sky tonight, but you can simply type in a date and ask what the sky looked like thousands of years ago. And then I will summarize. So firstly, let's just summarize what was in the Gospel of St. Matthew, and I'm going to highlight 5 key elements of the Gospel in red, which are the elements describing the Star of Bethlehem that we are trying to match up with an astronomical candidate. So firstly, the Magi journeyed to Jerusalem prompted by a star in the east. That's the first thing we've got to think about. Bear in mind, they saw a star in the east and then decided to go west. So the idea of them following a star, well, sort of, but not quite. They saw a star in the east, but were prompted to go west. They interpreted the star in the east as being a sign for the birth of the King of the Jews. Why might it be that that was the sign that they interpreted from the appearance of this star? When they asked Herod about this, Herod didn't seem to know what they were talking about. He wasn't aware of this star, or at least the interpretation of this star as indicating birth of the King of the Jews. The Magi then journeyed on to Bethlehem, where the star reappeared in the sky, and then the star stopped in the sky. So those 5 things in red are the 5 elements that we would like to match up to a candidate for the Star of Bethlehem. If we can hit 4 out of those 5, then maybe we've got a valid candidate. So before we jump into that, let's just remind ourselves about another source of information about the Star of Bethlehem, perhaps not too reliable, but we'll listen to it anyway, at least the first verse. Just remind yourself about the lyrics. Join in if you like. That's enough of that. All right. We three kings of Orient are. I'm a scientist, and most scientists like accuracy, and we like precision. And when we look at the lyrics of We Three Kings of Orient are, we ask ourselves, why does it say that there were 3? Because there's no mention in the Bible, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, about 3 magi, 3 wise men visiting the baby Jesus. It talks about 3 gifts. Yeah, right. Gold, Frankenstein, and myrrh. But that doesn't mean that there were 3 wise men. There might have been 20 wise men, 3 of whom brought gifts, and the other 17 turned up saying, I didn't know we were supposed to bring gifts. So we really shouldn't have 3 people in the title because there's no indication that there were actually 3 people there. Okay, so let's get rid of the 3. Kings. Where'd you get kings from? There's nothing in the Gospel of St. Matthew about the Magi being kings. Magi, plural of magus, wise men, but not kings. So we really ought to take that out of the Christmas carol as well. And where were they from? Well, it doesn't say. So they were from perhaps Persia, perhaps India, perhaps Outer Mongolia, somewhere in the Orient, but it wasn't actually stated. So we ought to take the geographic origin out of there as well. And remember, they saw a star in the east and decided to go west. So following yonder star is a bit of a stretch as well. So you can see this Christmas carol is rapidly falling to pieces. And if you allow a physicist to write a Christmas carol, then we ought to replace the missing words with something more specific, such as not we three kings of Orient, but we indeterminate number of men of unspecified geographic origin are, and we saw a star. Now, you can see why physicists don't write Christmas carols. It's more accurate, but it doesn't meter quite as well as the original. But just bear in mind that we shouldn't ever talk about 3 wise men. We should just refer to n wise men, where n is a number between 1 and infinity. Magi is plural for magus, and I gather it's gender indicative of male. Therefore, it is wise men, but we don't know how many of them. So just the n wise men. Another thing to bear in mind when we're talking about the Star of Bethlehem is we shouldn't take star too literally. These days, we understand the difference between a star and a planet, for instance. But if you go back a couple of thousand years, then the word star was simply used to mean something visible in the night sky. Bear in mind that some descriptions are still attached to the word star. So, for instance, when you see stars in the sky, we think of some of them as fixed stars, not in the sense they don't move. As the Earth rotates, they appear to rise and set, but they appear to rise and set in patterns that are fixed, constellations. In other words, stars are fixed relative to other stars. But as well as having the fixed stars, we have wandering stars. Well, okay, not quite the same as the Lymm version, but wandering stars in the sense that some stars, some points of light do appear to move relative to the fixed stars. Nowadays, we call them planets and we know exactly what they are, but in the early days, they were referred to as wandering stars. Some stars in appearance are very stellar, very point-like, but some have tails, and they were called broom stars or hairy stars. We now know them as comets, and we know that they are icy bodies, and as the ice evaporates, as they get close to the sun, they can form a tail. But originally, broom stars or hairy stars. And one colloquialism still survives to this day. Meteors are often called shooting stars. So tiny particles, maybe the size of a grain of sand or something, shooting into the Earth's atmosphere, compressing the air ahead of them, making them hot, and hence they glow and you get a streak of light. So bear in mind that when we say star, it could mean almost anything in the night sky other than the moon. I think we all agree that we can recognize the moon when we see it. Apart from that, anything else is fair game. Okay. Do we get any clues by looking at the depiction of the adoration of the Magi? Okay, these have been painted centuries later, of course, but in most cases we find that the adoration of the Magi is depicted as 3, and nearly always kings as well, so 3 kings keep coming back, and at the top there we see the Star of Bethlehem. In some cases, the Star of Bethlehem is only just visible. In this particular case, this is Botticelli's adoration of the Magi. That's widely believed to be Botticelli himself on the right-hand side there, photobombing his own painting, which is very clever. And there's Joseph at the top there looking very bored and not taking part in any of the celebrations. Perhaps that's appropriate because allegedly he didn't take part in the conception either. So, yeah, okay. And again, you go through art and you usually see something depicting a star, except for Giotto, who actually had something that would be interpreted as a comet. Most people just made it a point of light. Giotto said, well, maybe the Star of Bethlehem was a comet, and up there, something that is fairly convincing with a very long tail. There are some depictions where the Star of Bethlehem seems to be absent completely. This painting by Rubens seems to have no Star of Bethlehem. It makes up for it, though, by having a 2-headed camel at the back there. And again, we don't really get any clues from looking at other artwork. It's nearly always a star, if it's visible at all, shining down onto the nativity scene. Not surprisingly, the artists were making paintings. They weren't documentary evidence of what the Star of Bethlehem was. They're just paintings which the artist thinks the audience would like. Bear in mind that everything in the night sky would have had some astrological significance. Eventually, astrology and astronomy parted ways, but back in the early days, a study of the night sky was the same as the study of astrology. Putting interpretation on what was seen was what people did. It's not simply a question of what's in the night sky, is that going to tell us the timing of when we plant our crops? They also figured that there was some interpretation behind the appearance of every planet, every wandering star, every bright star, every zodiacal constellation. The constellations of the zodiac are the 12 constellations through which the sun, the moon, and the planets appear to move as they move around the sky. So, of particular relevance to this evening's talks is particular interpretation of, for instance, the planet Venus, a very bright appearance in the evening and morning sky, basically the brightest planet in our night sky. Venus was often associated with beauty and fertility and birth. Jupiter, which is almost as bright, but again dazzlingly bright when it's at its brightest, Jupiter is considered to be the king of planets and is often associated with royalty. We now know that Jupiter actually is the largest of the planets, but of course that wasn't known at the time. They just knew it as one of the brightest planets. The brightest star in the constellation of Leo is called Regulus, and as you can perhaps see from the first 3 letters of its name, there is again an association with royalty. It's known as the king of stars. It's the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. And Leo is called Leo because the outline looks a little bit like a lion. A number of different cultures interpret that constellation as being relevant to a lion. And the lion is sometimes associated with the lion that identifies the land of Judea or the people of Judea. So we've got Regulus, the brightest star in Leo, and Leo is associated with the land of Judea and the people of Judea. Why do people attach astrological significance to what's in the sky? Well, it's because it was believed centuries ago and certainly millennia ago that what's in the night sky is basically a message from God. God will decide to position the stars and the planets and any other objects that might appear such that if you are able to read the night sky, you get basically the intention that God has for mankind. Are we going to have a good harvest? Are we going to have a flood? Are we going to have a famine? All of that is written in the stars, literally as well as metaphorically. And so if you know how to read the night sky, you know what God has in store for mankind. One way of thinking of it is to assume that basically the sky is God's Facebook page. That's where he posts anything of importance. So it's important that astrologers watch the sky night after night to see what's going on. So let's have a think about what possible candidates that we know exist might conceivably have been the Star of Bethlehem. We're going to think of the candidates and then ask ourselves, does it match the 5 criteria that we picked out of the Gospel according to St. Matthew? The appearance of a star in the east, it must have been significant and interpreted as the birth of the King of the Jews. Herod, for some reason, wasn't aware of it. The star reappears and the star stops. So let's pick the first one, a shooting star. Is it possible that a meteor, a shooting star, was the Star of Bethlehem? Doesn't seem very likely because meteors occur all the time. Meteor showers occur many times during the year. And during a meteor shower, especially under very dark skies, you will see lots of meteors, maybe a meteor once every minute or even more often than that for hours at a time. So there will be flashes all over the sky during a meteor shower. So why would you talk about a star in the east when there's dozens of them flashing over the sky? So that doesn't seem very likely. What about the appearance of a comet? Well, yes, some people believe that the appearance of a comet was the Star of Bethlehem. Now, indeed, it can appear in the east. Comets fall into the inner solar system from essentially any direction, so they might appear in the east, first visible. So yes, it could be a star in the east. And if it's bright enough, it might be the sign of something interesting happening. Why it would be interpreted as a birth of the King of the Jews, well, we're not too sure. If it is bright enough to be interesting, why wasn't Herod aware of it? Well, Herod didn't actually have very good eyesight, but he had a whole load of astrologers in his court, and they presumably were looking at the night sky and then informing him of anything interesting that was happening. So how could a bright comet appear that Herod was unaware of? Doesn't seem very likely either. What about a nova, a new star? Not a new star in the sense a new star coming into existence, but a star that was originally so dim it was not visible to the naked eye. Then they can brighten such that they are visible as if a new star has appeared in the sky. We know this happens from time to time. We know there are nova which brighten, sometimes quite substantially, and then they fade away after a few weeks. And it is possible for them to reappear again, but usually decades or centuries later. So the idea of a nova appearing and then reappearing in the sky a little while later doesn't seem to fit. There's also the possibility of a supernova. A supernova, as its name implies, is a very bright nova. Again, it's not a new star as such. It might be that this star was totally invisible and suddenly brightened substantially. A supernova, we now understand, is a star that's come to the end of its life and blown itself apart. And in the process generates a huge amount of energy, and so supernova can be very bright. We have historical records. Possibly they were hysterical as well, but we have historical records of supernova going off, and they are bright enough not to simply be a bright star in the sky, they're bright enough to be visible in daylight. So we know a supernova would be a spectacular event and could, in principle, have appeared in the east. But again, if it was that spectacular, why wouldn't Herod be aware of it? And again, the idea of the star reappearing, generally speaking, once a star has blown itself to pieces, it doesn't usually do it a second time, so that doesn't seem to fit. So you can probably guess from the fact there's a small gap here that there is another candidate which is one that is definitely worth thinking about, and a number of people, scientists and scholars, think that maybe one of these type of phenomena are what we're talking about in the Star of Bethlehem. We're talking about a conjunction of planets. As planets go around the sun, they're all moving at different speeds, and every once in a while, planets seem to come close together in the sky. They don't necessarily bump into each other. All the planets are orbiting on planes that are slightly tilted relative to each other, so as the planets go around the sun, they usually miss each other. They might pass quite close to each other, and close in this context means separated by the distance of, let's say, your little finger held up at arm's length, about the same as the diameter of the full moon. So you can imagine points of light, night after night, getting closer together, and then they miss each other by a small margin, about the distance you could squeeze the moon in between, in terms of how we see it in the night sky. And as you can see here, it is possible that a conjunction of planets, if they were bright enough, could, in principle, tick all of the boxes. Conjunctions occur every once in a while, and we can see that in just a little while in the next few slides. And it is possible that a significance is applied by an astrologer to a particular planet becoming in conjunction with another, with a particular constellation in the background. And it is possible that the astrologers in King Herod's court came to a different conclusion, even though they saw the same phenomena, and therefore King Herod didn't know about the birth of the King of the Jews. The planets are in constant motion, so a conjunction can occur, and then it can occur again later, possibly months or years down the line. And as we will see shortly, it is also possible that a planet can stop in the sky. Let's just, to make sure that we understand what we mean by conjunction, astronomers are familiar with this idea, but let me just make sure everybody is happy. Let's imagine two planets going around the sun, a green planet and a red planet. The green planet is closer to the sun, so it feels a stronger gravitational pull, so it moves faster. This is the way it always works. So you can see the green planet not only has a shorter racetrack to go round, it's also moving faster. And so the inner planet goes round the sun a lot more quickly. In other words, its year is a lot shorter than the red planet. But you can see that if they're moving at different speeds, every once in a while, as seen from Earth, planets will appear to be in the same place. And because they're moving at different speeds across the sky, they will separate, and then at some point later, they will appear to be in the same patch of sky again. This idea of the inner planets moving faster than the outer planets, that's a universal law of gravitation, effectively. But it's very important for what we're talking about when we think if we are on the green planet, so imagine we are looking at the sky from the green planet, and we're watching this planet in an orbit outside us. So in other words, Mars or Jupiter or Saturn. Because we are moving faster than these planets, generally speaking, planets, as seen in this particular diagram, moving anti-clockwise from this direction, planets will move from west to east, generally speaking. But every once in a while, the Earth overtakes it on the inside lane because it's going faster, because it's closer to the sun. So just like on a motorway, if you're all traveling in the same direction, but if you overtake a car, for a little while, that car will seem to be moving backwards. As far as you're concerned, from your perspective, the car is moving backwards, simply because you're moving faster than it. Same is true of planets. For outer planets, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, they will usually move west to east. But when the Earth overtakes it on the inside, from our viewpoint, it looks like the planet is moving backwards. So what actually happens is the planet is moving west to east, but as we overtake it, it stops, moves backwards, and then starts to move forwards again. So it makes a sort of a little loop or an S shape in the sky. The planet usually moves west to east, but when we overtake it, it stops, starts to move backwards and stops, and then continues moving forward again. And I'm saying move here as in move in the sky. The planets are just continuously moving around the sun, but from our viewpoint, as they track across the background stars, it looks like, let's just run that again, it looks like the outer planets move and then stop, and then for a little while go backwards, and then continue moving forwards again. All planets do this. Now, whether or not ancient astrologers understood that, they would certainly have seen it. They didn't necessarily understand why the planets did that. They just noticed that these wandering stars occasionally do this odd-looking loop. So let's think about the timeline. Let's think about what astronomical events occurred at around about the time of the birth of Christ. So the first thing we need to sort out is, when was Christ born? And that's a little bit iffy because we don't know when Christ was born. Some people believe it was a few years around about 6 BC. Okay, it's not 1 AD. And bear in mind, if you do ever use a bit of software to say, what did the sky look like when Christ was born? If you dial the clock back, remember that when you go backwards from 3 AD to 2 AD to 1 AD and back another year, you don't reach 0. There is no such thing as a year 0. You go straight from 1 AD to 1 BC. I'm telling you this simply because there are some apps where you can dial in the date and they get it wrong because they put a year 0 in, which is incorrect. So we think Christ might have been born in this period. Why is it 4 BC? Well, we think the limit there is 4 BC because many people believe that King Herod died in 4 BC. And Christ was born during King Herod's life. Therefore, Christ wasn't born after 4 BC. But some people believe that King Herod's date has been mistimed because you never find a document saying King Herod died in 4 BC. If you do, you know it's wrong for obvious reasons. King Herod's death was timed by his death came after the lunar eclipse, which came after the flood, which came after the famine, which came after whatever. In other words, events date events. There's no such thing as a fixed calendar. So when we look at King Herod's death, some people say, well, it might have been 4 BC, but some people believe we've got the wrong lunar eclipse. And in fact, it was the next lunar eclipse that actually was immediately before his death. So some people believe that King Herod died in 1 BC, in which case Christ's birth might be a little bit further over. Quite why people don't believe in that gap, I don't know, but the main point is there's a big uncertainty in exactly when we should be looking for the Star of Bethlehem. So that said, what candidates do we have? Remember, we know where the planets are now, we know how they're moving, we know where comets are now, we know how they're moving, and therefore dialing the clock back 2,000 years is virtually trivial. Because if we know with enough precision where things are now and where they're moving, then simply asking where they were 2,000 years ago is straightforward. Asking where they were 2 million years ago is tricky. 2,000 years, not a problem. So for instance, we know there were some comets around. There was a very bright comet around in 12 BC. How do we know? Because we've seen it. Halley's Comet comes round periodically. We can basically put a stopwatch on it and we know how often it's going to arrive, and we can work backwards and say it would have been in the sky in 12 BC. And it probably was quite bright, so it would have been reasonably spectacular. But why would God post something on his Facebook page quite so early? If he was trying to give a sign, why was it 12 BC rather than a few years later? There were other comets around. If I'm talking to an astronomical society, I would talk more about those, but the bottom line is these comets are very faint. They would probably not be visible to the naked eye. And of course, telescopes weren't around 2,000 years ago, therefore they wouldn't have been seen, and they would definitely not have been spectacular. So comets don't seem to fit the bill. What about the idea of a nova, a new star appearing in the sky? Well, we have records that the Chinese say a nova appeared in 5 BC, and the Koreans say a nova appeared in 4 BC. A nova that was bright enough to be seen with the naked eye, we see them all the time with telescopes, but one that's bright enough to be seen with the naked eye, they don't come along too often, once every 100 years or so. What's the chances that you wait for a century and then two come along at once, like buses? It is more likely that we've got a little bit of an error in there when we're trying to take the Chinese calendar or the Korean calendar and convert it to a common calendar. Perhaps we've mistranslated something. So those two nova are almost certainly the same nova, seen in late 5 BC or early 4 BC, depending on who actually recorded them. But remember, although there might have been a nova in the sky recorded at about the right time, nova don't seem to fit the bill, because a nova is a star, and why would you talk about a star stopping in the sky? Because the star isn't moving relative to all of the other stars anyway. And it's unlikely that the star would reappear as well as stopping. So that doesn't seem to fit the bill. But remember that we thought conjunctions might well fit the bill. And here I'm using a little bit of astrological symbols for brevity. That dumbbell symbol is an astrological symbol for a conjunction. And the symbols here, the curly 4 stands for Jupiter, the curly H stands for Saturn, and you're probably more familiar with the symbol for Venus, the circle and the cross. So there were two interesting conjunctions. One was a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn at about 5 or 6 BC. And some people believe that could have been the Star of Bethlehem. That conjunction also occurred back in, I think it was 2021. I'm not sure if anybody saw the conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn in 2021 at Christmas time. No, that shows you how spectacular it was. Everybody missed it. So if nobody here in this audience out of 50 odd people remembers that particular event, then it certainly wasn't particularly spectacular. Jupiter can be very bright, but Saturn generally isn't. It's further away and it's much fainter. So when Jupiter and Saturn get together in the sky, it can easily be missed. And I would argue it probably was back in 6 BC. But if we, for the moment, accept the fact that King Herod might have died in 1 BC, then there's another conjunction here, which I think is much more interesting. This is a conjunction between Jupiter and Venus. Jupiter and Venus, the brightest stars in the sky, the brightest planets in the sky, the brightest stars as seen by somebody 2,000 years ago. Spectacularly bright Venus and almost as bright Jupiter. So let's have a look at what the sky would have looked like. Let's take a bit of software and show you a patch of sky. I know you can't read any of the numbers up here. What we're doing is staring at a patch of sky in which we have the constellation of Leo. So this sort of software can usually show you what the night sky looks like with a horizon, etc. I've taken the horizon away because it's too confusing, and I'm not showing you day and night, that's too confusing, and I'm not labeling all of the planets and the stars because that just gets so messy. So the zodiac is across here, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, etc. So the zodiac, the racetrack of all of the planets, etc., is top right to bottom left. And at the moment, I've marked Jupiter there. And here is the constellation of Leo with a sort of backwards question mark that a lot of people interpret as looking a bit like a lion, and that's the lion's mane. So let's have a look at, in this particular case, August 3 BC, what was in the sky and when. So there's Jupiter, and there is Venus in the constellation of Cancer at the moment. Remember, Venus is one of the inner planets that moves much faster than Jupiter, which is one of the outer planets. So Jupiter will appear to move fairly slowly. Venus will appear to move a lot faster. So let's run the video forward a few weeks. As time goes by, Venus and Jupiter get very close in the sky. And in this context, very close means separated by maybe a finger's width. Let's say the diameter of the full moon. How might an astrologer see this? A very bright Jupiter and a very bright Venus have come into conjunction in the constellation of Leo. How do they interpret Venus? Birth. How do they interpret Jupiter? King. How do they interpret Leo? The land of Judea. So Venus and Jupiter in conjunction in the constellation of Leo could have been interpreted as this is a sign that there's going to be a birth of the King of the Jews. This particular conjunction would have appeared in the morning sky in the east before sunrise. So this conjunction of two very bright planets was a star in the east. And astrologers might have said this is a sign telling us about the birth of the King of the Jews. Let's watch the sky for a little longer and see if God has anything else to tell us. So they watch the sky a little longer. Venus continues to move because it's moving quite quickly from west to east. Jupiter is moving more slowly, but notice it's getting very close to that bright star there. That's the brightest star in the constellation of Leo. That's Regulus. So the king of planets has just passed the king of stars. Earth is now overtaking Jupiter on the inside lane, which means Jupiter has now stopped in the sky. The video is still running. Jupiter has stopped in the sky, and Jupiter is now moving backwards in the sky, moving towards the west rather than the usual east. What happens? Jupiter passes Regulus a second time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars again. Now that Earth has finished its racetrack maneuver and overtaking Jupiter on the inside lane, Jupiter stops in the sky again and then resumes its west-east motion. And Jupiter passes Regulus a third time. The king of planets has just passed the king of stars, not once, not twice, but 3 times in a row. Astrologers might say, this is interesting. It's something to do with one king handing over the crown to another king. Definitely worth keeping an eye on this in case it's very interesting. They keep watching the sky and ask what happens next. Venus has been around the sun and is now coming back again, and Venus gets really close to Jupiter this time. Not separating 2 points of light by the size of your finger. These 2 points of light are going to get so close together, they cannot be separated as 2 points of light by any human vision. And that conjunction, that close, is very rare. I think a conjunction this close only happens a few times in 1,000 years. And therefore it's a given, pretty much, that the astrologers of the time would never have seen a conjunction like this before. Now, remember, they've only got their naked eyes, but we can get an indication of just how close Jupiter and Venus were in the sky by zooming in as if we had a telescope, which of course was not available to the astrologers. Let's zoom in and see just how close these planets were. This field of view is much smaller than a human can resolve. The resolution of the human eye would be bigger than the size of this room. So the disk of Jupiter as seen from Earth and the disk of Venus as seen from Earth, at rather different distances, remember, but the size of the planetary disks are so close they effectively kiss each other. A human would simply see them come together and merge together. 2 very bright points of light would merge together to give you one even brighter point of light. And this, again, happens in the constellation of Leo. So you get a second conjunction of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo, birth, king, Jews, with a spectacular conjunction. So maybe this was what convinced the Magi, we definitely need to go and talk to King Herod about this because something interesting is happening. So if I reduce that set to a cartoon, they saw a close conjunction, not that spectacular, but two very bright points of light close together in the sky, that would definitely be seen as significant, and they might have interpreted that as birth of the King of the Jews. They then continued watching the sky, and they would have seen the King of Planets pass the King of Stars not once, not twice, but 3 times, a so-called triple conjunction. And then if they kept watching, they would have seen a spectacular conjunction of Venus with Jupiter in the constellation of Leo in 2 BC, some months after the first one. Maybe that was the starting pistol that told them, go and talk to King Herod, because something interesting is happening in the land of Judea. How long did it take them to get there? Well, we have no idea. Remember, we don't know where they came from. Did they come from Persia, India, Outer Mongolia? Were they walking? Did they have camels? If you believe the Christmas cards, they always have camels, but that's not good documentary evidence, so it could have taken them many, many months. It's interesting, but not conclusive, to note that if it did take them a few months from that point to get to Bethlehem, Jupiter did indeed stop in the sky in December of 2 BC. Now, whether that's when the Magi arrived or not, that's just guesswork. But it is interesting to note that Jupiter did stop in the sky in December of 2 BC. Which particular day? 25th of December. Yep, complete coincidence. It just happened to be the 25th of December. We know that the Christian holiday of 25th of December was just taking over a pagan festival of Saturnalia, so there's no particular relevance to that. It's just an interesting coincidence. So we know that these things happened. We know that the 2 conjunctions happened. We know that there was a triple conjunction of Jupiter with Regulus. And we know Jupiter stopped in the sky in December of 2 BC. So this stuff we know happened. Whether or not they were interpreted as the words in the bottom there, that's speculation. But it's interesting speculation. So the bottom line is, maybe it was the conjunctions of Venus and Jupiter in the constellation of Leo that basically produced what we now think of as the Star of Bethlehem. Even if it wasn't in the Bible, it still happened. It would have been seen. Perhaps people would have passed this sight down from generation to generation. Stories would be told about this spectacular sight in the sky, and maybe decades later, this spectacular conjunction eventually got woven into the narrative of the Gospel of St. Matthew. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was that conjunction and something else that happened. Maybe there was a spectacular conjunction and a comet, which we don't know about, that appeared in the sky. The bottom line is, we can tell what was in the sky in terms of what the planets were doing. We can calculate where they were to fantastic precision. We can calculate to within a minute or so when those particular planets would have been in conjunction. Even though it's 2,000 years ago, that level of precision is not difficult to achieve. So working out the astronomical events is easy. Second guessing what the astrologers would have made of those events if they saw them, that is speculation. But regardless, the message, of course, is still the same. And the message is, I wish you all a very Merry Christmas. Thank you.